Turns out, according to Israeli media, the Iranian protests that have been used as a source of justification for the attack and war on Iran turned out to be not so organic as previously reported and widely reported, to be frank, by the US media. If you want to know what the truth is, read the Israeli press because they do tell the truth. And in this case, I learned about this thanks to The Dissident, one of my favorite Substack pages that I highly recommend reading if you want to be informed on foreign policy. So in that Substack post by The Dissident, they broke down the article by the Israeli newspaper Ynet, and here's what they report. A regime can be overthrown from above by relying on senior officials, or it can be overthrown from below by cultivating mass protest and armed resistance by minorities. Israel has chosen both options at the same time. It will both chop off the chicken's head and cook its own legs. The sterile term influence, they further write, does not express the scope of the effort and sophistication. Faced with a regime that is all poison, Israel has set up its own poison machine. The organization began 4 years ago and reached operational maturity 2.5 years ago. This is a weapons system that, if activated at full power, could be deadly far beyond the boundaries of the social network. So basically, there were, I believe it was the Kurds in Iran, they were being armed by Mossad agents on the ground in the lead up to these protests. And the protests, by the way, I wanna be clear about something. The protests started off as something that you could consider organic because we have implemented crushing sanctions against Iran, and the Iranian people are suffering as a result of that. So some of them took to the streets in order to protest the economic conditions, not the IRGC. They weren't trying to overthrow the IRGC. So once they take to the streets, that's when Mossad gets activated with the armed Kurds and things get violent. Because remember, even the New York Times reporting indicated that the protests were peaceful and then suddenly it was like a flip of a switch. Things suddenly got super violent.
Yeah, so Mossad had actually said something online before about how they were next to the protesters in Iran.
Yes.
And so that was already kind of rubbing it in people's faces. Now Israeli press has confirmed, no, it was a Mossad operation to try to cause unrest. And part of the reason for that is regime change, but the other part of the reason is to use it as an excuse to drag America into war. So, but after you see this, you will not see this reported in mainstream media in America.
Correct.
The Israeli press is way more honest, partly because they're internally, they've got an election coming up. They're bragging to their own citizens. Oh, we're so good at manipulating America, a bunch of suckers over there, and this is how we manipulate them. We're so good at starting wars. So they're being more honest in their case, but American media was like, shh, don't ever say anything that might hurt beloved Israel.
But look, there was some reporting in the New York Times. Obviously, they didn't clearly state that this was all manipulation, right, in order to push for war and regime change in Iran. But I wanna give you a few excerpts from a March piece that was reported by the New York Times. They wrote that as the United States and Israel prepared to go to war with Iran, the head of Mossad, Israel's foreign intelligence service, went to Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu with a plan. Within days of the war's beginning, David Barnea, that's the Mossad chief, his service would likely be able to galvanize the Iranian opposition, igniting riots. Let me read that again, igniting riots and other acts of rebellion that could even lead to the collapse of the Iranian government. Barnea also presented the proposal to senior Trump administration officials during a visit to Washington in mid-January. And then Netanyahu adopted the plan despite doubts about its viability among senior American officials and some officials in other Israeli intelligence agencies. Both he and President Trump seemed to embrace an optimistic outlook. And then they proceeded with the decapitation strikes, killing the Ayatollah, and the war got started. So let's go back to the Ynet reporting as reported by The Dissident. So on February 11th, Netanyahu arrives at the White House. Remember, the war starts on February 28th. In a meeting held in the Situation Room, Mossad chief Barnea appears on the encrypted conference call monitor speaking from Israel, and he presents the plan to the president in all its parts. And as we all know, because this was also reported by the New York Times, the Israelis did a good job persuading Trump to do something that even some of his advisors discouraged him from doing, starting the war with Iran. And using the protests that were totally manipulated by the Israelis as the justification for carrying that out. We want to liberate the Iranian people as we proceed to slaughter them with our carpet bombing campaign.
So now let's talk about the rest of the media, because I'm enraged about the New York Times, as you've seen on the show many times, right? But we point out to you guys from time to time, oh, look, that's an interesting piece that the New York Times wrote. That one's actually accurate, and it has real information, it's not biased, etc. And a lot of times they'll put an important fact in the middle of a story. It'll be like in paragraph 17, oh, by the way, Iran hit our warships. I don't know why that's not the headline, that's a giant story, but they actually state the fact in the middle of the story. And then they kind of cover it up in other ways. But I'm a veteran of this. In the lead up to the Iraq war, we were on the air, oldest show in online history. And Ben Mankiewicz and I at the time would show you all the time. Wait, on the front page with big giant headlines, they warn about weapons of mass destruction. But what's really weird is on page 827, they have an article about how US intelligence says there is no weapons of mass destruction, right? And so so now when you see the New York Times reporting this one accurately and Ynet, an Israeli paper, reporting it accurately, so what should you look out for? Well, is the rest of the press going to say, hey, and for them, the New York Times is the gold standard, right? And the Israelis are the gold standard of everything, right? Will they all from now on say, oh no, those protests were not organic, they were organized by Mossad. And even if some of the protests were organic, the violence was organized by Mossad.
That's right, yes.
And I'm gonna predict to you ahead of time, they will never say that. They will not say it on cable news. Every single one of them that talks about it will say that it was organic, and they won't mention this reporting at all. In fact, other articles in the New York Times will ignore their own reporting, and they'll come back around and say in every other article about how there was organic protests and the Iranian government crushed those protesters, and without any evidence at all, they claimed 30,000 or 40,000 people were killed. It's collective amnesia, it's done on purpose. So they can say, well, we did report that there were no weapons of mass destruction before the Iraq war, right? But, oh, golly gee, we forgot about it in every other story. And I guess you came away with the impression that they did have weapons of mass destruction. Every time you ring the bell below, an angel gets his wings. Totally not true, but it does keep you updated on our live shows.